Hello and welcome to Wrestling and Everything Coast to Coast with your hosts, Buddy Sotelo Esquire, Mike Leno, and Evan Ginsberg. Do you want to introduce our very special guest for tonight, Mike Leno?
Yes, we will. And Evan and I are doing the ultimate book. We're hoping it's going to be one of the greatest books on wrestling ever, but on John the Golden Greek Tolos. Very honored to have his son, Chris Tolos, with us. So I'm going to start, unusually, by throwing right to Evan. Ev, in New York City, or Long Island, but he was in New York City last night at, where were you, Ev? You were at the major concert at 30 Rock.
I was at Radio City Music Hall to see the Swell season from the movie Once, which is a beautiful movie about street musicians in Europe. And they won the Oscar in 2008 for Best Song. And beautiful music, beautiful music. Blue-Eyed Soul. Anyway, we are honored to have Chris on board, and let me just share this before I toss out any questions. When I was a kid, my father was a New York City taxi driver, and he worked 6 days a week, 14 hours a day, and I did not see a lot of him, unfortunately. But among my fondest childhood memories, and he died when I was 20, was we would sit and watch the LA wrestling in New York on the Spanish network, and my father loved John Tolos. He just found him so amusing, the promos and the insults and, heel John Tolos. So I have these great memories of sitting with my father watching Chris's father. And then we went to Madison Square Garden to see John Tolos against Bruno, which was such a thrill for me as a kid to experience this. And many, many years later, as a quote unquote wrestling journalist, I was backstage at Herb Abrams' UWF, and I interviewed John Tolos for my old newsletter, and he was just so gracious and warm, and it was just a great experience meeting him. And so I've always just had this, sense of awe as far as John Tolos. And many, many, many years later, we're doing this book, and every wrestler and his mother seems to have a book. Here's somebody that deserves a book, okay? And Chris, I know that's a long-winded introduction or whatnot, but my question would be, what was it like to have a celebrity father who, sometimes was on the road and away? I could see it possibly being a mixed blessing. What was it like?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here, you guys, and for all the great, kind words about my dad. I really appreciate that a bunch. Life was definitely interesting, but you know what? We tried to make it as normal as possible. Obviously, there were a few bumps in the road and all, but things were pretty good. Obviously, it was hard. He was on the road a lot. Who knows, 250 days a year, 300 days a year, but he tried to get home for birthdays and definitely for Christmas. And of course, I'd get spoiled. Perhaps there was a little guilt there. So that was the good side, but in reality, he was just dad. And a lot of times if we were out and strangers would approach him, he would always deny that he was John Tolos.
Wow.
Yeah, obviously he had a wrestling character that was definitely more the villain style. So he never wanted to make anything uncomfortable for myself or for my mom. I mean, I still remember he was so disliked in the wrestling world that even a couple of my teachers, I remember one teacher in particular used to give me a hard time when he found out that he was my father.
Wow.
Yeah, he gave me a very difficult time telling me, oh, your dad's a phony and this and that. And I didn't know, back in the day, wrestling was a close guarded secret of whether it was real or whether it was fake. So when I was a kid, I only knew it as real. That's what it was. My dad didn't tell me any differently. So I remember coming home crying one day to my mom and saying, Mr. So-and-so was mean to me and he talked bad about dad or whatever. And my dad caught wind of it. And my mom was basically just holding him back by his belt because he wanted to go have a little conversation with that teacher.
Wow.
So in that sense, it was a little different growing up. But in general, at home, he was dad. He barbecued. We'd play by the pool. He'd put me on his shoulders, take me to the park. He helped coach my little league teams.
Wow.
It was as normal of a childhood as you can get.
A mutual friend of ours, Mickey Doyle, talks about the coaching, and he just loved your dad. Any memories of Mickey Doyle and your father?
Mickey Doyle was a wrestler. Let me clarify. Mickey Doyle was a wrestler. He came into our territory for X amount of months in 1975, and really took. I mean, he knew. He's like a historian, fan turned wrestler, and so he was in awe of your dad. But Evan was telling me that Mickey said that he coached softball. So let me shut up. Does that name? Do you recognize the name Mickey Doyle? He lived actually.
I believe his son Brett played on one of my teams or was in the same league or division. I can't remember, but I think we were even on the same team, perhaps. But I just can't remember. But I do remember the name Mickey Doyle. Sure.
Now, I had a question. Did your dad ever tell you that he would like to see you try wrestling or do something in the wrestling business?
When I turned 18, I graduated high school and I hit the gym, and my goal was actually to follow into his footsteps. And he was very excited, but you could imagine how excited my mom was.
Not.
So I bulked myself up. I'm 6'5", so I bulked myself up to about 235, 240. We'd work out in the gym, and then we'd practice wrestling on the mats. But it just got to the point where I just knew it wasn't really for me. I just didn't have that love or that passion for it. But I will say it was fun. We belonged to a gym, and once in a while we would go at it in the middle of the gym, and you would just hear people screaming and trying to break us apart. And I mean, screams to call the police. It was funny sometimes. It really was funny.
And did he ever actually take you to the matches as a kid?
I would go occasionally because obviously the character he played, he felt a little, I'd say, uncomfortable. He didn't know safety-wise because at the time when he was still at the top of his level more there in the 70s, I was a young kid. So he didn't want people to know who I was. So he didn't take me too often. And when he did, I usually hung out in the dressing rooms.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And what was your reaction when, as a kid, you met some of these legendary wrestlers? They must have been larger than life, I would think.
It was very cool. Of course, I really got into wrestling more like the Hulk Hogan era. So my dad was pretty much at the end of his career and retired, but he used to take me to the sports arena to go see the wrestling matches. And even at the Olympic Auditorium at the beginning, and I just loved it. I mean, I was meeting all my heroes, and they would tell me nice things about my dad, and it was kind of cool. I was on the top of the world, and I would bring friends from school, and oh my gosh, my popularity just zoomed up to the top.
Chris, who do you remember meeting? And I'll throw back to Evan. Who do you remember meeting at that period? Was it like Hogan, Brutus Beefcake, Greg Valentine, Randy Savage, names like that, or?
Yeah, that was pretty much my my era there. I remember my favorite story, actually. There was a wrestler named Kamala,
right?
And he was the Ugandan giant, and the whole gimmick was he didn't speak English, and he had a manager. I think his name was Friday or something. So I was in the locker room, and I wanted to meet Kamala. So my dad at that time didn't let me know that it was real or fake, but I had my suspicions. So he wanted to introduce me to Kamala. So Kamala came over to introduce himself. And then my dad kind of jumped in and talked to his translator and said, "Could you please introduce my son to Kamala in his language?" And I'll never forget the manager translator was just trying to make up some weird language. Goody goo 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 gaga, son John Tolos. It was the funniest thing before the guy reached out and shook my hand. But there were some funny stories for sure.
Chris, let me just quickly say, Evan and I interviewed Kamala a couple of times, and the very first time he broke kayfabe and spoke was on our show, but he also sang on that show. First time he ever sang anywhere on the planet. His real name was James Harris. I'd known him for, well before he became the Kamala character, but we lost him to diabetes. Wonderful guy about a year or so ago. Beautiful person. We loved him, Evan and I. We brought him to, I don't know if we brought him to this show with Russ, but Ev, let me make sure you're done before I interrupt again.
Oh, no, that's okay. Kamala was also an R&B singer, believe it or not. Yeah,
I had no idea.
Sugar Bear Harris. That's his, his first wrestling name when he started.
Interesting. I'll tell you another wrestler that I really enjoyed meeting, and this is when I was training with my dad, was George the Animal Steel. And I was talking to him and telling him I wanted to become a wrestler, and he took me aside and basically said, this is not the lifestyle for anybody. Don't do it. So I never forgot that, actually. I never forgot that, his advice.
While we're on Evan's question, can you think of anyone else you talked to or have other stories?
Oh, my gosh. There was the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov.
Well, Iron Sheik, we just lost about 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks, something like that. He just died. Khosrow Vaziri.
I didn't know that. I'm sorry.
Was he a close friend of Evans?
Yeah.
And Nikolai's gone too. It was a rough road for these guys, and your dad included, because, as you said earlier, these guys were wrestling 300 plus days a year, and it takes its toll. So, how did your mom feel about, your dad being on the road so much? And, it's not easy for a wife or a kid, or, it's a tough life.
It's true. I mean, my mom basically was a single mom in some respects, because my dad wasn't there. He was just on the road so much. So it was hard. And I think it definitely takes its toll. And obviously their marriage ended in divorce. But I definitely think it's hard on everybody. It's hard not being near your family. It's hard, when your family's not with you. It's just a hard situation. And it's funny because there's shows on TV like The Rock, or there was a movie called The Wrestler a long time ago, or not too long ago.
Yeah, we know someone who's involved in that one.
Yeah,
I was the associate producer on that film.
Awesome. But I remember going with some friends, and they were like, "Oh, the phony." I'm like, "No, you don't get it. That's what it's like for a lot of these guys. A lot of them. There's just so few that actually make it to that level."
Chris, do you have any brothers or sisters?
I do have a half sister, actually, and she has a daughter.
Okay, and what was her reaction? Do you think it was similar to the feelings that you had, or maybe not, because of the?
To be honest with you, I probably met her when I was, I was probably in my mid-30s. So
she came out. She was like from New England or the Boston area. She came out to the funeral. You were kind enough to ask me to be a pallbearer at your dad's funeral, but that's the first time we saw her. We kind of gasped. She looked like a fashion model, Chris.
She's a wonderful woman, and she's got a beautiful daughter too, and she's happily married. So wish him the best. But in terms of growing up, by the time I met her, I was already an adult, and she's older than me, actually. Oh, she'll probably kill me for saying that, but.
But you're pretty much an only child then, for the most part.
Yeah. I was raised an only child.
Okay. Let me ask Chris on Evan's question. Did your dad have wrestlers come to the house? Or did Ingrid not, it was not cool to bring some of those wild men to the home?
We did have a few. The ones that stick in my head that I knew were Freddie Blassie would come to the house, and then there was a referee, Red Shoes Dugan,
Johnny Dugan,
who would
Yep.
come to the house. I remember Andre the Giant came to the house. I remember actually getting picked up. I think I was in kindergarten, and my dad came to pick me up, and Andre the Giant was in the car. And I remember the seat was all the way back because there was no way he could really fit in the car. But I remember he came to the house, and I remember getting all my friends in the neighborhood screaming, "The Giant's at the house! The Giant's at the house!"
Wow.
Wow, that's pretty major because that would be before Andre, all that stuff with Dwayne Johnson.
Oh yeah.
So that was way before that.
Yes.
Can you think of any others? Or how about when your dad and Freddie were at your place and they could let their hair down? What was that relationship? Because they were like the best of pals, but then they would go, and Freddie, with some help from your dad, became the biggest babyface, beloved, where people would cry when he'd wrestle your dad, and Fred would be on defense. And your dad was our lead heel, mega heel, the 1971 angle for pretty much most of the year or whole year before that led to the August 1971 outdoor LA Coliseum, where they, as the main event, John versus Fred, with Fred trying to get his revenge on the Golden Greek, blew away and outdrew all of the previous record holder, Lou Thez, the god of wrestling, his California gates and his California attendance, with just that LA Coliseum near 29,000 people, whatever the legit figure was, but it was well over 28,300, give or take. And it was on closed circuit all over the city. Did your dad talk about that? Because Fred ended up quitting the promotion because he felt promoter Mike LaBelle, Eileen Eaton's son, stiffed both he and John on their paydays that they were owed from the closed circuit, which was the first, only boxing was doing that. And it was only in its infant stage with Muhammad Ali fights. But they were all over Southern California, and as far as like Fresno, San Jose, with a closed circuit of that. But then please answer if you can recall him talking about that, and then how he and Freddie were at your home, together.
Right. Well, obviously during that whole time, I was basically still in a crib, so I don't, in that sense, I don't remember. By the time I remember my dad hanging out with Fred, their feud was over, and they were definitely a little bit older. But he'd come to the house and they'd barbecue and drink beer and just talk about old times, and he'd have his wife. My mom would be there. We met him once in Palm Springs, I remember, at another friend's house. But it was just kind of like normal, just conversation. They were just guys from what I remember. But I do remember in the talking about the issue with the closed circuit TV, I do remember my dad mentioning that even as he got older, if we were talking about a big pay-per-view event or whatever, it would come up and he'd say, I started that at the Coliseum with closed circuit TV and we got screwed. And so I think that always bothered him. I think that bothered him.
What about his relationship with Mike LaBelle? Because when John started in LA, it was actually our genius booker who retired in '74, Jules Strongbow, but he was actually the promoter when your dad first came to LA in the '50s, and they had quite the great rapport. I mean, Jules Strongbow was the one that did the storyline writing, the quote-unquote matchmaking, but it was basically, he was the script writer for all of the angle, John throwing the powder, the blinding Dr. Bernhard Schwartz. It's the cut powder to stop the bleeding of boxers, because Bernhard Schwartz was the ringside doctor for wrestling and boxing. The whole, the LaBelles owned all of that in Los Angeles. And it was like January, February, we'll have the dates perfect for the book. But Fred's getting Wrestler of the Year, Most Popular Wrestler of the Year award. Your dad goes berserk, goes into Bernhard Schwartz medical bag, this is at the KCOP Channel 13 when we still had that. That was not the TV that anybody outside of Southern Cal saw. Instead, it was our second weekly TV, the Hispanic show from the Olympic on Wednesdays that was beamed back to Hispanic cities around the country, like New York, Boston, Tampa, Miami, of course, parts of Chicago. But and so Jules. So did you remember Jules Strongbow perhaps ever coming to the house, or because Fred and John had one of the longest feuds in wrestling, and they had their last match like in '81 in the what was renamed the Blassie Cage. It was basically the cage that Fred and John had worked in, but it was a tag match with an NFL player, Walter Johnson, and then I think it was Victor Rivera teaming with your dad as the bad guys, and Freddie and this green football player. So Fred would also come. He would at least drop into L.A. about once a year. Either he was on his way to New Japan for Inoki in Japan to manage, or he had family still. He and his wife Mayoko, who he met while a wrestler in Japan. That's the wife that he brought to you, the Japanese American lady, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, Miyoko, very sweet lady. Ev, let me throw back.
Okay. Chris, any memories of your uncle that you were named after?
Not wrestling, just more personal, going to Canada and hanging out with my dad and uncle, and kind of, I always thought I could maybe take my uncle, especially when I was getting beefed up and 18, I was ready to go. I thought I was strong, and I remember I put him in a full Nelson. I came up behind him and put him in a full Nelson. I thought I'd take him, and he broke that so fast.
Wow.
I mean, he had an amazing physique, even in his 70s. I mean, he was running like 5-10 miles a day, working out. I mean, he ripped abs. I've never seen ripped abs in somebody 70 years old. I mean, phenomenal. But it wasn't really talking about wrestling then. He had an amazing garden. He had an amazing green thumb. A phenomenal cook.
He had 2 cookbooks. I've got one of them.
Did he have 2 cookbooks? I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
Did your dad ever talk about what territories he liked the most? Which ones he liked to work the most?
No, but I'll tell you, I enjoyed it when he worked the Hawaii territory, because we got to go move to Hawaii. so I can tell you that one I enjoyed.
Where'd you live in Hawaii?
We lived in Oahu.
Okay.
We were in Waikiki at the Ambassador Hotel Apartments, I think.
They just had to go through that senseless fire tragedy, unfortunately.
I was over there because your dad had periodically gone there, as Fred did, for promoter Ed Francis, along with Lord Blears, was the co-booker and the guy that helped and did all the TV for Hawaii. But your dad would do, periodic, but then he became a regular. And we're trying to get Steve Strong on the show to talk about your dad. But he and Billy Graham came in, and then Steve ended up feuding with your dad and teaming with him, winning the tag titles. But your dad was there pretty much, so that's when you were there, like 77, 78, right?
Yeah, I was going to say it's the late 70s. We were there. Yeah.
What title do you think meant the most to your father? What title reign meant the most to him?
That's a good one. I think it wasn't even so much about the titles, because he knew he was going to be like given the title only to lose it, just to kind of bring on the heat and then give it up. So there's nothing I can remember. I remember in Hawaii, and I can't remember what belt it was. I have a little picture as a little kid with his wrestling boots on and his belt around my waist, but I can't remember which one it is. But I'm going to guess most probably is the tag team titles with his brother. I'm going to say those were probably most memorable to him.
Because they won them everywhere. Did they ever talk about the places? Because until your dad turned babyface good guy in late 1971, I'll get to that in a bit, and your dad was mega over when he turned babyface, and they had one last run where Chris came in to team with him out of the blue and to feud with guys like Killer Kowalski, who Evan and I knew very well, Superstar Graham, who was debuting his tie-dye look for the very first time, the psychedelic look, with your dad, a feud with your dad, all in that year, and then Ernie Ladd, etc. But the Tolos Brothers team one last time for a good long run of about 4 to 5 months in Los Angeles, and Chris, super knowledgeable, everyone I've talked to, super sharp in the stock market and investing in Canadian stocks, bonds, etc. But when he was doing his promos, he acted like a dimwit jock, which was like 180 degrees from who he was. And he would like intentionally mispronounce, like he couldn't pronounce Kenji Shibuya's name. So for months he kept calling him Shibui. And they would piss off, and then he'd screw up Killer Kowalski's name. Sometimes he'd call him Vladik or Walter, just to, people didn't know what was going on, but that was like a practical joke for anybody that knew Walter was Kowalski's real name. And he'd call Billy Graham a pansy. But so when I say that kind of stuff, does that kind of jive with, like, Chris Sr., as I call him, was a super intelligent guy, big heart, a lot of different things about him. But I think your dad had more fun, one last time with Chris, because they ruled the tag team division all over the U.S. and Canada in the 50s and 60s as bad guys. This is both the very first time either one of them were babyface good guys, 1972, basically, for that big long run.
I'm sorry. Was there a question, or I didn't know if you were?
Well, the question was like,
we're all stunned.
Chris.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
The question was basically, did they talk about teaming one last time, but as good guys, and winning the hearts of all the fans who, normally would have like thrown rocks or cups of Pepsi or beer at them. Instead, they blew the lid off the place. They had an legit hour match with Kenji Shibuya and Killer Kowalski as the main event tag match. And we normally didn't have tag matches as the main events. And the lid blew off the place. No pyro, no girls, no entrance music. It was just John and Chris Tolos. They were over like $1 million.
Yeah. If they did, they never included me in the conversation. As they got older, they would talk about their wrestling days a little bit, but not too much. It was more just kind of, brotherly stuff, being brothers, growing up, their parents, life, that type of thing. It wasn't always all about wrestling. I guess they had their wrestling life, but then after their wrestling life, they were just people. He was my uncle, and my dad was my dad, and that was it.
When you guys would go up to Hamilton, I guess, was it what we were told was that Chris, that was the one big last run. Now Chris would still do lower, tier matches, kind of helping fill in at Maple Leaf Gardens, nearby shows around. But we had heard Chris kind of was semi-retired, A, because he made a lot of money with stocks, and B, to take care of your aunt. Now, I have MS. My mom and 2 uncles had it. But to your recollection, was your aunt, their sister, was she like, we were told she was wheelchair bound, and Chris was primary caretaker and also taking care of their mother.
He did go home, yes, to take care of his sister and his mom. That he did. And he was loyal. He was extremely, extremely loyal. I mean, it was unbelievable what he did. Unbelievable. And
John would like take periodic breaks whenever he'd get pissed off at promoter Mike LaBelle, like on a payday or whatever. But he would always tell me, hey, I'm going, to visit Chris and my sister. I'm going to do some spot shows, like in Vancouver, to see his friends Don Leo Jonathan and Gene Kaniski were running the promotion with Sander Kovacs. He would definitely go to Houston a lot, where he'd be, he'd just come in off the street, and he was in the main events with his best friend, who was playing the good guy to John's heel in Red Bastien. And John was very close to promoter Paul Bosch in Houston, which is an amazing, huge territory. And then Johnny Valentine, another friend of John and Chris's since the early 50s. Did he tell you about, because he'd be gone, but in the 70s, but that's where I don't know if he talked about going to Kansas City, Vancouver, Houston, Dallas to, do some spots at the same time, either before or after he'd go to Ontario to visit Chris. And what was your aunt's name, if you can tell us?
Mary. She's still alive.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she's still alive, doing well.
Wow.
The only thing I really remember from the 70s was Vancouver, because many times my mom's side of the family, she had a lot of family in Vancouver, so I would usually hitch a ride and fly up with my dad. And so I'd stay with the relatives while he wrestled. and then he'd either go somewhere else or he'd fly back with me. But that's the extent of what I knew was going on there in Vancouver, Kansas City, Houston. I didn't know that much because, again, I was very young, very, very young.
Remember, I was running their fan club, so he would feed me this stuff or mail me results and clippings. Let me just ask before I throw back to Evan and Russ, how did your parents meet? And was your mom in Vancouver? Was she originally from there before coming to LA?
My mom was actually from Germany, and then she immigrated to Canada. And from what I remember, I believe they met in Vancouver.
Wow.
Yep. And I believe they got married in Vancouver, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
So, Chris, I would like to ask you, who do you think your dad's favorite opponents in the ring were?
Well, he always spoke highly of Fred. I mean, really spoke highly of Fred. But he always liked.
Blassie, I'm assuming, right?
Yes, Blassie.
Yeah.
He always spoke of. Oh gosh. Well, I know he was close friends with Vic Christie. I don't know if they ever wrestled, but that was.
Your dad took one. I should throw this in because your dad, when Vic and Ted Christie were guys that kind of helped John and Chris, but particularly John in LA, like 52, 53, whatever the year was. And then when they were much older, and your dad took care of them in the nursing home. He and Jean LaBelle would go to visit them, and Lord James Blears quite a bit whenever John was in Hawaii, but particularly Vic Christie, who was a gentle rib artist, not mean ribs, practical jokes. Yes. Your dad took care of him like a dad or a grandfather.
Yeah. Oh, they'd always, gosh, at the time I remember I was working in a fish restaurant, and Vic Christie was staying in a motion picture hospital, which was probably a few blocks from our house at the time. And my dad would pick them up, and they would come to that fish restaurant, and they'd have the entire staff and all the guests just roaring in laughter. Two of them were crazy. They were the two that, the managers would finally come up to me and be like, "Chris, you have to ask your dad to leave now."
Because the movie Stars home was I think it was like in Woodland Hills. Your dad loved that area. I also lived there in the 60s, but your dad loved Woodland Hills. Another legendary wrestler was a ton of TV, the Jack Benny Show and stuff, 50s, 60s. Count Billy Varga, as well as Baron Michelle Leone. Your dad looked in on them and in their last years. It was really a sweet side of your dad. Your dad, rough, tough, yelling, screaming. Then the second name that came to him is the Maniac, John Tolos, in 1973 against Victor Rivera. But then to see this sweet side of him going and constantly visiting and brightening their day and giving them the will to keep on, living when they were really ill, it was something to see.
It was, even at his funeral, the wrestlers that showed up, nobody had anything bad to say. I've never heard any wrestler actually say anything bad, at least that I've overheard. I'm sure there's something out there somewhere, but in terms of just talking to me, everybody always just, had the most wonderful and kind things to say. I mean, I remember going to Baron Leone. He had a pizza place somewhere close to LAX in that area, or Imperial Highway or whatever. And I remember going there and they'd give me rolls of quarters to play the arcade games, and they would all sit in the back. There was usually a group of wrestlers, and they would just have pizza and have a good time for a few hours.
And that's the guy who John against Blassie in August of 71 beat the gate and attendance record, was Lou Thez, world title versus world title, and I forget the year, in the 50s, against Baron Michelle Leone, who was amazing. Evan, I better throw to you.
So, Chris, your dad headlined Madison Square Garden 3 times, the Tolos brothers twice, and also, as I said earlier, Bruno against your dad. Then the huge match with Freddie Blassie, 27 or so thousand people. But when it was all said and done, like so many wrestlers, there were 9 to 5s. What kind of adjustment was that, after the fact?
After retiring, you mean? Or going
Yes.
I think with anybody, it's a tough life because, Wow, it's just a different lifestyle. All of a sudden, you're kind of home, so you have to readjust to being home, which can be an adjustment sometimes, especially when you're not used to being there, and to actually getting a job. I mean, my dad went to work for NBC for a little while after retiring.
Right.
I know that took a little adjustment. All of a sudden you're on a schedule. You're commuting at 7 in the morning and you're coming home at 5. Well, he wouldn't come home at 5. He'd go directly to the gym because he was definitely just an athlete all his life. All his life.
So I would bring up the one elephant in the room topic. Even though everyone does have something nice to say about your father, he did get stuck with a really bad gimmick towards the end of his career.
Well, let me clarify that, because we're doing this for the book. He told me that the biggest guy that got him the job as the coach, which is kind of because your dad always was talking about amateur and collegiate football. So that was his gimmick in WWF. He said Fred Blassie recommended him highly, got him the gig, but your dad said it didn't work out because he was more of an extemporaneous speaker who just would create magic on his own. Instead, he either had to read off a teleprompter, as we bitched about on the show, or memorize dialogue. That wasn't him. What did he tell you about that period when he was the coach, managing first, I think, the Beverly Brothers and then Kurt Hennig? Why that was short-lived? Because we were really hoping that would have happened, because you had like 3 of the greatest talker, 4, Piper, Ric Flair, your dad, and Freddie Blassie all there at once. What did your dad say about that time?
Basically, it was hard for him because, they took his gift of gab away and they stuck a whistle in his mouth, and all he was allowed to do was blow this whistle, and that wasn't him. And they didn't want him to, like when he was with Herb Abrams, he'd kind of get involved in the matches a little bit. I remember one day he got on the second rope, took his shoe off and hit somebody in the head with the heel of his shoe. And he loved that because it brought back memories. And when he went to the WWE at the time, he thought he was going to be able to build on that and have fun. And they basically told him, you're not going to speak. You're going to just blow this whistle. We don't want you to take any bumps or get hurt. We don't want you to interfere with any matches or anything. So he felt he was just like this guy just standing there. He really didn't have anything to offer. So I don't think it turned out the way he wanted it to. I think he had a different idea when he started.
It's really unfortunate because I think if he had been able to do more of what he was all about, he could have been a more successful character. And he had good talent to work with, especially with Kurt Hennig. And it's just, and then of course,
what I'm going to do is encourage people to go on YouTube. I have the master tapes, the LaBelle and the Shire. But go back to whatever interviews you can find. I would suggest the 1973 where John Tolos, as a heel, he turned back heel in the hair versus hair match with Victor Rivera. They were both baby faces, but when your dad lost the match, this was like March of 1973. And then he attacks, goes nuts, attacks Victor Rivera after his head is shaved by Jimmy Lennon, our incredible ring announcer. Then he got the nickname from Dick Lane, who was our major KCOP TV announcer, Maniac. And that's when they kind of pushed the Golden Greek part aside, and it was always being introduced as Maniac John Tolos. But the interview he did where he's like picking up, it was like one of the longest promos he ever did, about 14 minutes, a whole segment before commercial break, taking a bite out of different Hispanic, Mexican foods, enchiladas, burritos, tacos, and spitting it out and criticizing each one of them. And now you couldn't do it, not PC, but it was really all off the cuff, not and in it. You just straight Tolos promo. And it's pretty incredible. I don't know if Evan got to see it, but or any of the stuff with Blassie, but a lot of that is only straight audio because at the time we didn't have VCRs. So from like 1969, 70 on, we just tape them on a reel-to-reel cassette. But that's the interview stuff. That's the stuff, not any of the WWF crap or even the Herb Abrams junk or the California Championship Wrestling when your dad was managing Toru Tanaka. But Ev, we got to get some more questions in here.
I remember when he came in to wrestle Bruno in New York, he does a promo and he called Bruno a spaghetti bender, And those were fighting words back then. You know, it was great. It was great. So, yeah.
He knew how to bring the heat on. That was for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Build it.
Well, Chris, have you heard what? Let's hear what you think. And maybe did you ever talk to your dad about his interview style? Because he could yell and scream when he was a heel, or even when he was a babyface. It was different. Particularly '72, he turned babyface quite a few times, but '72 was the very first time for he and your uncle. And John kind of stopped screaming, and instead of yelling and screaming, he would say, "It's America's title belt." He would say, "This is the people's belt. It's not my belt." But you must have heard a lot of your interviews, the classic ones where he's yelling and screaming. What did you think? And did you guys talk about any of that? Or I know he was like one of the to break kayfabe, so he probably never smartened you up. I don't know if he ever did smarten you up.
I didn't go watch him wrestle too much. Like I said, I'd stay in the locker room, and part of it was I didn't like to watch him wrestle. It always bothered me, and I think just for that reason, I remember I was ringside once, and he finished the match. He beat a wrestler. I think it was Butcher Brannigan, and he came to me and he said, "Open your hand." And I opened my hand. He put something in it. And he's all, "Hold on to these for me." And I opened my hand, and it was his 4 lower teeth. He had a bridge. He had him knocked out in the match, and he didn't want to lose him, so he gave him to me. That was a funny memory. It's funny how the old memories come back. But in terms of interviews and stuff, I honestly didn't see too many interviews. He was very protective. I didn't see too much of the yelling and the screaming at all. I mean, very, very minimal, to be honest with you.
Because it was state-of-the-art stuff he was doing then. This was way before Ric Flair. And the stuff particularly with Blassie, the two masters, that had histories going back decades before they were on top in Los Angeles. But even the interviews your dad had with the Sheik, the real Sheik, Sabu's uncle, with, Ernie Roth was not the Grand Wizard. He was Abdullah Farouk, that other character of his. Or superstar Billy Graham, or Ernie Ladd, who could go toe-to-toe with your dad speaking. Ev, I think you must have seen, and a lot of that, Chris, is on YouTube, but Ev, let me throw back to you.
I just want to throw this out. Mike can tell you that in LA, which was, pretty much your dad's home base for much of his career, they erased the tapes. They taped over the tapes every week. So there is not mountains and mountains of footage of your father. And his career peaked, well before Hulkamania in the 80s. And so how would you like to see your dad remembered? Because as far as we're concerned, he's one of the all-time greats, but the average fan today, may not even be aware of his career, unfortunately. How would you like to see your dad remembered?
I'd kind of like him to be remembered as somebody that, kind of broke barriers in a way, in the way he spoke and the way he played his characters. I mean, he was so passionate about the profession, and he did so much for the profession. And that's actually the sad part, because yes, that always bothered him that, there weren't really many videos, so nobody really knew who he was outside of the people that kind of saw him in Los Angeles or saw the old TV or whatever. But I wish there was a way to kind of bring it back, so people could see how it started, how all these guys, you watch the wrestlers now, and they're, the way they talk and all, and people think, oh my gosh, what a great talker. But there were so many great ones before them. It's just, I wish somebody could bring that up so people could become educated of the whole history of wrestling, how it progressed and who started what and where it began. And
that's what our book is going to do. Your dad was one of the very first to use catchphrases. Like his infamous, he used this whether it was a face or heel. I'm going to get you, and I'm going to get you good. This is before Dwayne Johnson or Steve Austin, Stone Cold. Your dad was the very first, well more than a decade before Jake Roberts ever brought a snake to the ring. He brought his surprise box, and out pops the snake. Not versus Rocky Johnson, but against Tolos, the whatever it was, a 16-foot reticulated python. That was what was in this box that he kept wheeling out, this big, tall, vertical wooden box. And then finally at the Olympic Auditorium for their big match,
Against Blassie.
Snake against Blassie. And your dad had a lot of other firsts. You know, he invented the Roman gladiator death match. It was the first match I can recall before they had the later chain and dog collar matches where you would like take the guy's head and hit it on all four corners and then you would win. But the first guy to do that in a creative match was John's match in 1970, Roman gladiator death match, which he did against a number of people, not just Blassie, Neil Moskowitz, Black Gordon, etc. So that's what the book is going to do. Let me ask quickly, and then I'll throw back to Evan to end with his questions. The movie Grunt, we just lost Adrian Street a little over a week and a half ago, but he co-starred with your dad. It was like the lead billed villain. Did you go to the set, you and your mom Ingrid, to the set of Grunt, or what was that experience, if you can remember? I think the taping was like 83 for that thing.
Yeah, if I remember, I did go one day. We went. And I can't remember if it was Steve Strong that got me a little gig as an extra, and they dressed me up as like a Pepsi salesperson walking through the crowds with my little tray of Pepsis as the battle royal was going on. But I do remember that. And I just remember meeting Steve Strong there. But I know there were some other wrestlers. And Danny Spivey, I think, was another one, very nice guy that I met there too.
Do you watch wrestling now, Chris?
I'm sorry?
Do you watch
wrestling?
now?
I do not, no.
Okay.
No.
When was the last time you watched it?
I shouldn't say I don't watch it. I'll flip the channels and it'll be there for a second and then I'll move on because it's not what it used to be. I would say I was into it big time probably in the 80s with the Hulkamaniacs, and then probably when Steve Austin came around, I'd watch it a little bit. And then probably when The Rock was younger, I watched a little bit, but by then it came to an end after that. Yeah. My dad didn't even enjoy watching it. My uncle didn't enjoy watching it. Neither one were really into it at all.
Hulk Hogan just turned 70 on Friday.
All right, we only have X amount of time. Let me throw to Evan. Evan, I'm going to let you have all the questions now.
Chris, I practice Tai Chi, Qigong, yoga, go to the gym, etc.
People have to move, and you have to move in all different directions. You know, people just get caught up in moving one direction, whether it be jogging on a treadmill, riding a bike, or whatever. You can't do it. You have to be able to move in all different directions. That's advice. And that's why, like, the Tai Chi and everything is so valuable, because you are challenging your body and moving in different directions.
My Tai Chi teacher is 85 years old. He's practiced 70 years. He looks like Mr. Saito. He could kill you with his bare hands. So I highly recommend Tai Chi, Qigong, and yoga, and of course the gym, and try to walk 7,000 to 10,000 steps a day. Not more.
The best exercise the best exercise you can do is the exercise you're doing, or doing some type of exercise, basically. Or the best exercise you can do is the exercise you can stick to. There's a better way to say it.
Makes a lot of sense. Absolutely.
Evan, ask him about his grandparents, his John and Chris's mom and dad, what your relationship might have been with your grandma and grandpa on the Tolos side.
So by the time I came around, my grandfather had passed away. But I did get to know my grandmother. My grandmother made it to 102 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, and she was sharp as a whip. I mean, it was amazing. But my grandfather, I know, worked he worked in a tobacco factory. He was a tobacco blender and then became a foreman. And then my grandmother was a house mom taking care of the three kids. And it was actually funny because I just talked to their sister Mary about it, and the parents were not too thrilled about their kids becoming professional wrestlers. My grandma used to tell me she was hoping for a doctor and a lawyer, and she got two wrestlers.
Wow.
What were your grandparents' names?
Nick and Evangeline.
Evangeline with an E, or I'm
With
guessing
an
it.
EV.
Wow. Wow.
And Chris, do you still have a lot of connection with the country of Greece? Do you go back and visit it all, or?
I do go back on vacation, but no family there anymore. They've all moved. Yeah.
Where was the Tolos family originally? Was it Corfu or Mykonos? Where were they exactly?
It was actually, if I remember correctly, it was Volos.
Volos. Wow.
Volos on the mainland there in northern Greece.
Very interesting. Well,
Yep.
do you have any other final questions, Evan, that you'd like to ask Chris, or Mike? Do you have anything you'd like to ask?
What's your fondest memory of your dad, if you have one or two that come to mind?
I honestly have to say, I mentioned it earlier, when we used to actually go at it in the middle of the health club in the gym. I mean, it was so much fun because he would play it to the hilt. I mean, it was hilarious. Those are actually just fun memories. And just kind of hanging out in the pool, and him, when I was a little league pitcher, memories of him basically climbing the fence on the backstop, screaming and cheering me on. He was bigger than life, whether it was in the ring or whether sometimes it was just in normal life. He would be bigger than life.
There you go, Mike.
And he was, I think Blassie passed on the curse of being obsessed with tanning. Your dad, I know, every spare minute, in the wrestlers' private parking lot at the Olympic and other venues like El Monte, etc., he would go out there with the Sheik, Ed Farhat, got him one of these things where it's like a mirror thing to help, when the sun's out, you're kind of like reflecting even more of the sun on your skin. Now, of course, it'd be super dangerous. And I don't know if he had any skin issues, but I mean, when he'd come over to the Dawson house, Mark and Gary's house in Beverly Hills, he was just all about tanning. And your dad also was a jogger. Was it a jogger or running?
He was a jogger.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll tell you, both he and his brother were always dark. Always. I mean, they were just sun worshipers. It was incredible. And then I guess with the Greek skin, they just got darker and darker and darker and darker. But they both loved it. They could spend days out there in the sun.
It's great. So anyway, thank you so much for being on.
Yeah, Chris, you were awesome. I really appreciate it. We're going to do a great job. And Ev, I know you'll agree with me. He wants the story of his dad told. I think we're going to do a hell of a job.
We hope we do good by you. We're certainly going to try.
I appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing it.
And
one
anytime you want to come back on the show and talk about your father, you're more than welcome.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you guys. And again, thank you for inviting me. Had a great time.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Hey, Chris,
we'll
thank
see
you.
everyone next week. Good night, everyone.
Oh, before we leave,
Yeah.
Memory of my dad. What's the only way to spell wrestling?
TOLOS.
Yes.
All right.
Do you want to plug your business? Feel free.
Well, no, we weren't going to do that. We might cut out the fact because I don't want any nut job historian fans contacting Chris.
Okay.
But are there, Chris, do you have any charities or anything that you'd like to plug or send people to?
No, nothing that I can think of offhand.
All right. Well, that's fine.
Oh, let me ask one last thing. Did your dad have any family coda or saying that he kind of lived his life by? Was there any kind of thing that you recall, that your dad would like repetitively say about life or whatever? You can email it if it's,
Yeah, I'll have to think about it.
I think it's that when you think of wrestling, think TOLOS.
Well, that was, I mean, he was doing that since like the 50s, the only way to spell wrestling. And the other thing they did, particularly that was so cool when they came in 72 as faces, but in the 50s, when they first started teaming his heels all over the place, all over the country, Florida, New York was, John would say something and he'd go, right, brother Chris? And Chris would go, you're absolutely right, brother John. And they would do this back and forth. They did it everywhere, all across Canada, the US. But really for us, we loved hearing it in LA when they were baby faces and the place was going nuts for them instead of throwing trash at them and screaming at them.
Your dad was a tremendous performer, and entertainer, and we thank you very much for being here tonight. All right, good
Thanks,
night,
guys.
everyone. We'll see you next week.
Good night,
Thank
you guys.
Good night.
Appreciate it.